Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. How do you know when advice is right for you? We talk about some advice being excellent for some people and the same advice being terrible for other people. And oftentimes we put that down to personality type. Like certain advice works really well for certain, personality types that use certain cognitive functions because it is in alignment with how they're already wired to think. And maybe that same advice would be terrible for somebody who's a very different personality type. But one thing that's come up for us recently is this idea of timelines, that certain types of advice are fantastic during certain points in a process of development and growth. And it's terrible advice for other time periods in the process. So we've been thinking about advice in a more three-dimensional model. It's less just our character and how we're wired and our personality types, but it also adds an element of through time. Where are we at in a certain process? Where are we at in our growth and development in whatever area that we're focusing on our growth and development? And then how do we know if advice is right for wherever we're at in that process?
Yeah, if you're a longtime listener, you know we like to contextualize things down to the personality type. And for what you were talking about, advice being different for different personalities, just one basic example of this is the area of productivity, right? The book Getting Things Done, I believe, is written by somebody who uses the process of extroverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed effectiveness. If you want to learn more about that, you can head over to Personality Hacker, type in those words, and you can read a ton of resource about it. Also, the CAR model is a good search term to use on our website to get a framework if you're a new listener. But that book, Getting Things Done, is written by somebody that uses that process, and it just makes so much sense for that person. And it makes sense for people that are wired like that. But I've often struggled, I have some of that in me, in my personality, but I've struggled implementing his entire system. I think it's David Allen that wrote it, because it's just not totally tailored to how I go through my world productivity-wise. So I think productivity is a good example. You've probably read some time management and productivity books, and they work for you, and others don't. And it's probably the ones that are written by people of a similar personality type to you, or at least are writing toward your personality type. It resonates and works for you. What we're talking about today, though, is that idea, like you said, about timelines. We talked a lot about systems thinking here at Personality Hacker 2. We had a whole podcast on systems thinking back, probably over a year or so ago. In fact, it's a good one to probably listen to if you're not familiar with what systems thinking is. But basically, we have this idea that nothing is cause and effect. There's not one cause to one effect. Every effect or every result that we have in the world is the emergent property of an entire system of things running. So there's multiple things happening that create the results in our lives, in our world, in our experience, right? All through life. I won't go too much into the systems thinking theory and down that road because we have a whole podcast around it, but we talk about the different elements of a system being called nodes, the parts of a system as nodes in a system. And one of the nodes that I think we tend to gloss over is this idea of the node of timeline or process, or where you are in the stream of time or process in your life. Because everything else could be running perfectly, and you're implementing advice or things in your life, and all of a sudden it's not working for you, but it's working for somebody else, and what's the difference? Have you considered the difference in the node of where you are in the timeline of things? And that's really what we want to talk about and unpack today on this podcast.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head with why it's so important to understand this concept. And that is something that a piece of advice or strategy or tool or whatever it was that has been working for you beautifully all of a sudden stops working. And because you've been so reliant on this strategy or tool or whatever it is, this piece of advice, and it stops working, you're going to be very reluctant to let it go. In fact, you're not going to see that as the problem. You're going to misdiagnose the problem as anything other than this thing that's been working for you.
Yep.
And there's this, one of my favorite questions I heard maybe 8 years ago now, and I'm trying to think, if it's in the book Good to Great or some other book similar to it. But the question is, or not the question, but the comment is, what got you here won't get you there.
I think there's a book called that.
Oh, is it? Is it an entire book?
I think it's an entire book.
I think you might be right,
I don't
actually.
know the author, but I think it's a book title, actually.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, it was during a time period where I was reading a lot of business books, and one of them happened to be Good to Great. That was one of my favorites. But yeah, I think you're right. It is an entire book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And so this piece of advice or the strategy or tool in the course of the process, if you look at the entire process, the timeline of the process, which is not just the past and not just now, but also a projection into the future of that process. If it suddenly stops working, you're going to be reluctant to see it as the problem, as the thing that now needs to be abandoned in order to get to the next phase, because it's been working so beautifully up to now. And the reverse can happen as well. You may have tried something out that failed miserably, and so you go, oh, that thing doesn't work, not recognizing that it didn't work contextually at the point of the process you were in. And so when you get to the time period where that is the appropriate strategy for where you're at in your process, you're not going to go back and pick that tool up again because you already tried it out and it didn't work. So you're going to be reluctant to do the thing you need to do next, having had it fail, quote unquote, fail for you in the past, not recognizing that it wasn't the failure. It's just, it wasn't the right time to implement it. So the reason why this is such an important thing is, are you holding on to strategies that are no longer working for you, and or are you avoiding strategies that would work for you but in the past did not because of where you were at in the timeline? So that's why we're addressing this. We're addressing this because we may be not, doing something that is actually quite wrong for us, not recognizing that the thing that we're forgetting is timeline in the process.
Yeah, timeline is an ultimate contextual piece of the framework, right? As we go through, and this can apply for personal development, for relationships, what worked during your honeymoon in your relationship and how you interacted with your spouse or lover at your 10-year or 20-year anniversary, you don't interact the same way. You're different people maybe now than you were then. You might have a different experience in your relationship. Your personal growth, what worked when you were 20 may not work when you're 40, or what didn't work when you're 20 now all of a sudden seems to work for you at 40, right? And it applies to business too, business or careers as you move through your business and career. In fact, a perfect example of this is Personality Hacker in and of itself. Antonia and I, when we started Personality Hacker, we were in a startup phase. We're just the two of us behind a microphone and creating content and an emerging audience, an emerging body of community. And we could pretty much do whatever we wanted each month because it was just the two of us making decisions. We could steer the little, imagine like this little sail ship with two people running it. We could go to any island we wanted in the ocean at any time, as long as we had the resource to get to that island. So we're like, let's do this program this month. We would just decide it. We'd create it. We would promote it and deliver it to an audience. And we would do this for years. And now we're at this place where we've brought on a team of people and the ship's gotten bigger. We're in the ocean now. It's no longer a little sailboat. It's like a medium-sized yacht or cruise ship, basically, that we're going through. It takes a little more effort to turn the ship to just go off to that island over there to the side. It takes more effort. We have to talk to our team about it, make sure they're all on the same page. And so the type of habits we built in the past as we were building Personality Hacker in the very early days no longer work for us in the timeline or the context of where we're at. We have to do things, and this is hard for us. We'll need to rewire how we show up in business and how we show up in a communicative way because there's more people relying on us. We're at a different time period in our lives and in our business. So this is just it's a basic example of how we're in the middle of making a shift in our business world, taking the same principle into account.
Yeah. Well, and we're two EPs. You're an ENFP, I'm an ENTP. And so in the early days of entrepreneurship, that suited us very well.
Loved it.
Lots of hustle, lots of sprints, lots of working super duper hard and then taking some time off. And now that we're I don't know if I would say that we're necessarily like a cruise ship yet.
Not yet.
I would say we're kind of like mid-level, like kind of small mid-level size boat. But what is happening for us right now is that we're having to move away from sprints, which is what we've traditionally done, worked our butts off for like 2 months straight and then taken like 2 weeks to a month off. We did that over and over and over again. But we intentionally hired like literally nothing but judgers. Knowing that you and I are both perceivers, we hired a team of judgers. Every single person on our team is a judger except for us.
As of this recording.
As of this recording at this point. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to make sure that we had that represented. And of course, as soon as it happened, they reflected back to us a ton of blind spots. And one of those is our sprints. And we can't do sprints anymore. Like, we have to go into more of a marathon theme, which means that we can't work as hard like that we did, as we did in the sprints, but it also means that we can't just take time off. Like, we have to do more of a sustainable pace. So what got us here won't get us there. And we've had to make a lot of changes. So the advice that you would give to a small company that is going into more of a marathon phase is the exact opposite advice that you'd give to two people hustling, trying to get a business started off the ground. And I think we understand this when it comes to things like businesses, and we understand it in terms of being maybe parents and watching our children grow up. We're not going to treat them the same way at 14 as we did at 4. And we understand it when it comes to things like marriages. Like you said, what you do on your 20th year anniversary is very different than what you did on your first year anniversary. So we recognize this concept of timelines and adaptability over time, but I think we miss it when it comes to personal development. When it comes to our personal development projects, we forget that there are timelines involved in those too. So when we feel like we're stuck in a project, a personal development project, and we feel like we're not making any traction, and it feels like it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and we just feel all the sense of frustration, we forget to apply timelines to it because we want it to happen so quickly. We want it to happen fast. We want it to be like, we're always looking for that pill to swallow to just make it different. And even if we're in a space where we do the work, where we recognize, it's going to take a while. It took me like 40 years to get to this place, so it's probably going to take a couple years for me to get out of it. Even if we recognize that, we don't necessarily see the personal development project itself as a timelined process from the beginning to the conclusion. And some of our processes never have conclusions. There are elements of my personal development that I'm not attached to the idea that they'll still be around at the time that I die. But I'm kind of okay if they are. Like, if this is just a perpetual personal development project for me forever, I'm okay with that. That's just how it is. I've got some anger stuff from my dad had anger management issues. He is an ESTP and I'm an ENTP. And his anger came from his extroverted feeling 10-year-old process. When he couldn't control something, he would try to control through negative emotions. And my extroverted feeling 10-year-old process goes, oh, okay, that's how reality works. And it just slurped up that lesson. And now whenever I'm in a space where I feel out of control, I try to gain control back through emotional outbursts. And it's just a thing that I've done most of my life. Now, this is something that I've done a lot of work around. And I've noticed that the strategies and advice that I implemented at the beginning of figuring this out is different than now. Because at the beginning, it was a lot about awareness and just observing what I was doing. But now it's about patience and trying to allow myself some time and space before it even starts to emerge. So the advice at the beginning of that process was awareness. Just watch myself do it. Don't necessarily cut it off. Don't necessarily stop it. Just observe it happening in the moment so that I have awareness of what it looks like from beginning to end. That was the best advice that I was given during that time period. I'm many years into this. So now the advice has changed to, I need to build strategies and systems to prevent myself from getting to that space. So now I need to be constructing my life in a different way. I need to be recognizing when I have needs going unmet. So my awareness right now is less about the behavior itself and more about what are the systems creating the behavior. That's a very different thing to focus my attention on. Now I recognize what it looks like when I go into anger. Now I'm very familiar with that. I've been watching myself do it for years. I totally know what that process looks like. Now my awareness needs to be around, and implementation needs to be around creating systems that don't make that the emergent. And then there's going to be a different piece of advice that comes next further down the line in that process. It might be something very different than what I'm implementing right now. And I don't know what that would look like yet because I haven't gotten to that piece of the process. But if I kept just being aware of the anger, right? If I didn't change the style of how I'm addressing it, if I wasn't implementing different strategies, then I would still be stuck at having those behaviors and just watching them, which really wouldn't, how long can I do that before I go, okay, this isn't getting me anywhere? But initially, it was the imperative action I had to take. That was the first thing I had to do. So when you're going through personal development processes, recognizing that there are like basically time periods of these, there's like the beginning phase, and there's the exploring phase, and then there's the exiting phase. There are different levels of it. So if you find yourself feeling stuck, it might not be that you can't solve this. It might be that you are entering a different phase of this process, and you need to be looking for different strategies for this phase of it, because one piece of advice is most likely not going to get you through the entire process.
We attract a very high caliber of listener to the podcast and to Personality Hacker in general. When I say high caliber, I mean, you might be an evil, maniacal, serial killer. I don't know. But when I mean high caliber, I mean, you have I'm hoping you're a good person. That was mostly a joke. You have a sense of the future. You have a sense of what you want to maybe accomplish in the world. You have a sense, you have some intuition probably behind you, whether you're intuitive or not. You have some intuitive thinking behind you, some intelligence and some future pacing. That's why you're listening to this. You're finding tools and finding ways to better yourself. And I think when we're into personal growth and we're into these frameworks and models, we already see the end. Somebody that's listening to this, you're listening to this right now, you almost see the end point of where you want to be. And often the timeline of being there you're not ready for that yet. I'm thinking back, Antonia, actually, the reason I'm mentioning this is I'm thinking back to a coaching experience you had with, I think, a young man who had hired you to do some coaching, or I think it was around life purpose. And as you were working into the coaching, he was a very young man, and he was like asking you to help walk through some life purpose stuff. And by the end of the call, you spent most of your time focusing on, you got to get a schedule set. You got to get some sleep at night. You got to get a healthy framework. Like we're not even close to being able to talk about your life purpose because your life's a little bit chaotic right now. You don't have a schedule or any motivation. How are we going to ever talk about what your life purpose is until we get some basics down of just being able to function through your day? And so I remember that you telling me, I mean, you don't tell me the details of your coaching, like the person's name or anything. You were just giving me kind of a general impression of this. And I was like, that's really that's good advice. Basically, you're timelining that person. You're helping them understand where they are in the timeline of their development. This person could see so clearly the end game of having a life purpose, living on purpose, being fully purposely minded and living that purpose. But they were so far back on the timeline and they're young, there was so much they needed to do before they could get to that place for the coaching that they wanted from you. So I think that's key. I think that's an example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, real life example, because this young gentleman, he's a great person, and he was just having trouble like not staying up too late at night and playing video games and not sleeping in the morning. But he wanted to be on purpose. And I think that you're right, because we tend to attract people who are so good at future pacing and being able to really kind of embody what the end game, what they'd love the end game to look like. It's very easy to want to jump to that place, but you can't skip steps. That's like the number one rule of personal development is you can't skip steps. And so there was a component of, like you said, just getting sort of the basic life principles down first before being able to move into a space that he wasn't even like starting to be ready for. And I want to talk about 3 different models that help us gauge where we're at in timelines. And so when we get advice or tools or strategies, one of the things we can do is diagnose where we're at in these three different, I'll call them meta models. I'm calling them meta models because they're models that other models can fit into. That's what a meta model is. It's sort of an umbrella model that other models can fit themselves into. And so I want to mention these 3 so that you can find where you're at in these 3 different models, so that when you get a piece of advice, or if you pick up a tool or a strategy that you really like, you can determine whether or not it's appropriate for where you're at in these 3 models. And maybe you have a model that you really love. Like these are just suggested models. You can choose whatever model you want to diagnose where you're at in timelines. But the first thing we wanted to establish before we moved into these models is know that there are timelines to processes. There are nothing happens instantaneously, or very little does. So the thing about an instantaneous solution is that there is usually years of subterranean work that went into that. It's like the apocryphal story of the mechanic that comes in with a hammer and there's a machine not working, and the mechanic comes up and just hits the machine with a hammer, and goes, okay, that'll be $1,000. And the person was like, I could have done that. And the guy goes, nope, because you had no idea where to hit it. So anytime we see something that appears to be an instantaneous fix, there are years and years of skill development and information gathering and experience that ends up culminating in this instantaneous moment. So there's no such thing as anything that happens truly instantaneously. And so remember, everything is a timeline. Everything is a process that goes based on a timeline. And it's not a matter of skipping the timeline or skipping the processes. It's a matter of accurately diagnosing where you're at in them. And if you can't do that, if you're constantly trying to skip steps, you will find yourself at the same step perpetually because it just doesn't work that way. So we wanted to establish this concept of timelines first. Now that you know the importance of recognizing where you're at on the timeline or in the process, let's talk about these models and see if any of them will work for you as ways of diagnosing where you're at in some of your processes. Okay, so the first model I want to talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that piggybacks off of what you just mentioned, Joel, which was the young man who came to me for coaching around finding his life's purpose or like having a purpose-filled career when really he was just trying to get some basic elements of his life together. And this goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, we've done entire podcasts on Maslow, so please feel free to go back and reference those if you've never heard of it. Maslow's hierarchy is kind of like a Psych 101 concept, so you might be intimately familiar with it. So I'm just going to go over it really quickly, and then feel free to have more of a deep dive in previous podcasts or other resources online. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid that talks about certain needs having to be met before you can graduate to the next one. And it's a hierarchy of needs, meaning that if you haven't gotten the previous need met, you will not be able to sufficiently address the next need up. So you have to get them established. It's almost like a foundation of needs have to be established before you can graduate to the next higher need. So as you go up the hierarchy, the needs become more abstract, they become more emotional or spiritual needs, whereas the ones at the bottom are more physical. And that makes sense because if you're dead, you don't have emotional needs. So you have to get your physical ones handled first to ensure that you continue living. And that's how it works. So the very lowest layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the lowest layer is called survival. And it's basically getting through the day. You have to establish survival first before you can get any other need met. What's built on top of survival, so survival is like basically food for the day, shelter for the night. Sex comes under this because sex is fundamentally procreation that keeps the species going. So you can think of it in a macro way as well. Like our procreation as humans is part of our overall survival, so sex falls into that. And then once you have that established, you can move up to the next level, which is safety and security. So survival is getting through the day. Safety and security is cementing those survival tactics to be able to get through life in general. Like, you don't have to build a shelter every night because you drive to your house and you walk in and you know your house is going to be there and you're going to be safe in your house. So safety and security is about taking those survival tactics and turning them into sustainability. So you don't have to be thinking about them all the time, and that frees you up, right? Because a part of the hierarchy of needs happens based on having your mental real estate freed up to be able to think about the next thing. Once safety and security, and by the way, safety and security is like worrying about bills in the modern world. So if you're constantly worried about money and bills, you're in the safety and security level of Maslow's hierarchy. Once that is established and you feel a general sense of safety and security in your world, you graduate up to love and belongingness. And these are your romantic relationships, they're your family relationships, and they are your friendships. It's a general sense of connectedness, which all humans need. We have a need to feel love and express love and feel a general sense of intimacy and connection. And this is generally where once people have these three layers met, they oftentimes stop. And so we kind of frequently call it Maslow's basement. Those are your basement needs. Those are your basic human needs. But once you get love and belongingness handled, then you can move up to what's called self-esteem. Now, what's interesting is that self-esteem and safety and security can look very similar to each other because oftentimes it's an achievement mode in the modern world. Safety and security is going to work every day and making enough money to pay your bills. Self-esteem could be going to work every day, but it's not to pay your bills. It's it's to basically put yourself in a position of having challenges that feel spiritually good to overcome and to get through and figure things out. So self-esteem and safety and security can both be going to work, and they're for completely different needs getting met. So self-esteem is achievement. It's doing things that feel psychologically good. And then after self-esteem is handled, the top level at this point, and there's like some other top levels you can go research online, but as far as I'm concerned, Abraham Maslow had a pretty good, complete hierarchy of needs. And at the top of it was called self-actualization. Self-actualization is the desire to change who we are to become better human beings. So it's not just an achievement that makes me feel good that I addressed a challenge. It's actually that I'm looking at who I am as a human and I'm actualizing. I'm changing to become a better version of myself, and that's at the top. Now, in personal development, it's good to understand this because sometimes we're like trying to go into a personal development phase to solve our problems and challenges, when really our problem and challenge might just be that we're having marital fights. So it's actually love and belongingness that is the need that's going unmet. And in the case of this young gentleman, he wanted to be in self-esteem, but really what he needed to get was his safety and security needs met. So when you're trying to figure out where you're at in your timeline of your process, put the personal development like challenge you're addressing, try to fit it into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where does it fall there? Is it something that is in your mind? I mean, you might be in a healing time period in your life, and you might actually be in survival mode. Like your trauma might be so devastating to you, and it might be eating at you so much that you actually believe, you feel like you are physically unsafe in the world. That means your survival need is going unmet, and you can't address anything else until that gets addressed. Or you might be in a place where you are doing transcendence work, and you are trying to self-actualize, and you are at a much, much higher vibration. And that's the thing you're trying to address, but you might not really understand how to address it. And so you might be trying to solve it through self-esteem. Like if I just make more money, right? Like if I just am more successful in my business or my job or career, maybe that will help me actualize, when really it's actually more of a spiritual component you're looking at that point. So it's really good to figure out where you're at on that track and self-diagnose accurately, and then take your personal development the development challenge itself, not just who you are, but actually the actual personal development project you're working on, and figure out where it falls in Maslow's hierarchy.
And again, like I said before, most likely you listening, you're able to see the kind of the end game, maybe where you're going to be going in the future. And it's so tempting to want to just jump and try to focus on that when there might be some more fundamental things that you've got to work on. I just think of the old original Karate Kid movie where Mr. Miyagi is training Daniel in wax on, wax off, right? We've all seen this movie where he's just basically having him go through the mechanics. He came to Mr. Miyagi to learn how to defend himself and to fight the bully at school. And here Mr. Miyagi's having him wax his car, wax on, wax off. And I think that's the key here is there are things you might need to do mechanically to get yourself to the place where you can see so clearly in the future. And I think Maslow's a great tool for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, this is not like a lifelong thing. Like you don't graduate to these certain levels at certain stages of your life. This is a moment-to-moment thing. Like if you're in self-actualization and you're trying to become a better person and you're walking to, I don't know, like yoga class or whatever you're doing to self-actualize, and somebody mugs you, you are immediately in survival mode. And so this is not like an over your lifetime thing. This is a moment-to-moment thing. So diagnosing where you're at and where your personal development project is at on this, one of the nuances you might want to add is that you also have other elements in your life that might be putting you at different phases. Think of yourself as like stratified along this hierarchy, and try to diagnose where you're overall at, where your personal development projects are at, and maybe your life circumstances are throwing you into, because that might be all sort of different stratified levels of these needs. So it gets very helpful to get good at diagnosing where you're at on this model. All right, so the second model is something I pick up from Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And we've talked about this model as well. We call it, he calls it the dependence, independence, interdependence model. And we've done a full podcast on it, so please feel free to go reference that podcast for a more fleshed out conversation on it. But it's effectively we go through these phases when it comes to our relationship with our parents, when it comes to our relationship with the world. And I believe in our personal development projects, we go through dependence, independence, and interdependence. I think we have this relationship with almost everything that comes into our world. It's one of the meta models that I apply to almost everything. Where am I at? What phase am I at in my relationship to this idea, this concept, this person, this relationship, this situation? Am I dependent upon it? If I think it goes away, can I survive without it? Am I an independent, which means that I'm actually for a time rejecting it and seeing my life without it and experiencing who I am without this concept? Or am I in the interdependent phase, which is I can freely pick it up as a tool or as a relationship or as a person or whatever, like I can engage with it as a fully independent person and then have a moment when I'm engaging and interacting with it where I'm temporarily dependent upon it, but then I can let it go. So interdependence is like dependence and independence sort of squished together at the same time. You get to choose to be dependent upon it for a time in order to get through a challenge or to get through a situation or even to just enjoy it, right? Like I would say that yours and my relationship, Joel, I would call interdependent. But it's almost like a chosen dependence. Like we just enjoy the relationship so much. We want to be dependent upon each other in this way. But if we needed to graduate from it, I mean, yeah, if you died, got hit by a truck, I'd probably like not be okay for a long time. However,
I wouldn't be either.
Yeah. However, I know that I would be able to survive it.
Sure.
Yeah, you wouldn't be okay because you'd be squished. So I thought you were talking about if I got hit by a truck, but then I realized you weren't referring to that at all. You were talking about your state having gotten hit by a truck. Anyway, the point is that interdependence is the ability to choose your relationship with the thing at the time.
Yeah.
And when it comes to personal development projects and the processes that we're in, it is very important to diagnose where you're at. So when I talked about my anger management thing, right? I was originally in a dependent phase with my anger. I thought of it as a tool that had, like I was in its grip. It had me. And when I had a flame up of anger, I was not in control in that moment. I was very dependent upon it as a strategy. And then I moved to independence, which is right now I'm trying to live my life without it, right? Like I want to not have it at all in my world. Initially, if I had simply ignored it when I was in the dependent phase, if I had just every time I felt a flame up of anger, I would just completely ignore it, then I wouldn't have been able to understand it. I would not have been able to understand the mechanisms, its etymology, what it was doing for me. All I would be is avoidant in that moment, because I was dependent upon it. So I would simply be avoidant of a relationship that I was not in control of. So it would have a lot of subterranean control over me. Now I'm in independence, which is I've fully looked at this thing from a million different angles. I know how it works. I know how I work under it. I completely understand it. And now I'm trying to get as much distance from it as humanly possible. So now what I'm doing is I'm trying to create strategies so it doesn't even come up. And eventually, with anger, I will move to interdependence, which means that there are moments that anger is the appropriate response. Right now, if anger was the appropriate response, I don't know if I could go there because I'm trying so hard to create distance. I'm trying so hard to just live my life without it. Eventually, I'll be able to get to a place where healthy anger, right? Like the healthy indignation that we feel for truly abhorrent tragedies or truly abhorrent behaviors, I will be able to access it then. But it won't have me, I'll have it. So knowing where you're at in your process is very important because different styles of advice and different styles of strategies will be the appropriate one for you.
Yeah, I think Covey's model, I mean, you're listening right now and you're interested probably in Myers-Briggs. I think Myers-Briggs is a good example of this. If you're ever at a meetup group or talking with somebody and every answer to all the problems of human dynamics comes down to, well, they're this type or they're that type, of course they're going to do that behavior. That's probably somebody who's very dependent on the model. And then you have people who've transcended it, said, you know what, I used to be into the Myers-Briggs thing. I don't know if it might be bullcrap now. I don't know. And they're kind of like distant from it. They're probably an independent phase of that system. And then ultimately, the healthier expression, in my opinion, ultimately is getting to that interdependence where you realize it's not the end-all, be-all model of all human interaction, but it's a pretty good tool. And it can be useful at certain times. And obviously, we've built an entire business using this among other models. So it's an effective model to use in human dynamics, but it has a breakdown, has limitations to it. So that's just a quick little, walkthrough of how you could see somebody adopting a model or a framework or some way of seeing the world, distancing themselves from it, and then readopting it later through that process. And again, like what Antonia just said, this happens in all the different little models and frameworks and things we take on in personal development. And something maybe when we were in our 20s that was working really great for us stops to be effective maybe when we hit our 30s. And now we become independent of it. And then maybe later we rediscover it, 20 years later and in late midlife or elderhood, and we readopt it again because it's contextually useful to us then. There's all sorts of things like this in our lives as we move through the timeline. So I think that's a really good model. So the first one is Maslow. The second one is the Covey dependency model. What's the third one?
The third one is easily my favorite of all models. It is the Graves model, also known as spiral dynamics. We have done many podcasts around the Graves model, spiral dynamics, and I recommend listening to all of them and trying to fill your mind with as much spiral dynamics information as possible because I think it is an incredibly powerful model. I won't be walking through it because there are 7 known levels, and of course there's an infinite amount of levels after that. 8 on, and we can only kind of speculate about what that will look like. But I recommend going back and listening to the Graves model spiral dynamics podcast in order to accurately self-diagnose where you're at on the model. Remember, we have a tendency to put ourselves higher because we can see some of those components coming down the pike and we identify with them, but it's really about where you're living right now. What is your day-to-day experience and how much territory are you truly taking in? Advice that is excellent for people at Graves level 3 is going to be the worst advice you can possibly give at Graves level 5. And advice that's fantastic at Graves level 6 is going to be truly abhorrent advice for people who are Graves level 4. So knowing where you're at in your general developmental process is very, very important. And I would say that this is probably the one that trips most people up because we're getting advice from people who are usually at a higher level than we are. We naturally gravitate towards people who are where we want to be. Even if we don't know anything about spiral dynamics, we just have an intuitive sort of like an antenna that comes out and recognizes when people are are further along than we are, and those are the people that we generally choose to follow. Like we want them to lead us. So what ends up happening is that those people give advice for their current level, and then we try to implement it when we're not at that level yet, and it ends up disastrous. One example I can think of is a friend of mine who was a very new baby, brand new, fresh out of the blister packaging 6, right? Like a brand new 6 had just woken up and transcended to 6
green,
from 5.
Spiral dynamics green.
Green, right. Was engaging with somebody who had been in 6 green for a long time. And that person gave them the advice to just follow their bliss. Like the universe will just give them whatever the universe gives them. This is very Grave 6 green advice. And because this person had gone through 5 orange and had built $1 million business in 5 orange, they ended up going, okay, well, all of my resources are abundant. And they kind of basically stopped managing their business. And within a couple years, they were in a much better spiritual state, but they had completely ignored their financial state. And so their entire world sort of fell around them financially because they were following their bliss, right? And so what's interesting about this is that a 6 was giving another 6, or green was giving another green advice, but the one green, the one that was giving the advice, had never built $1 million business. Like that wasn't something they were familiar with. They were familiar with following their bliss and having the universe just give them stuff, right? Like that's just sort of that was their track. Whereas this other person was a brand new 6, but had gotten there through building a business. And so they needed very different advice. And they probably would have done better to get the advice from a 7. And the 7 had already been there. So the 7 would have given them much higher quality advice because they could say what all of the 6 experience looks like. So we want to make sure that when we're looking for advice, we're looking for people who have already gone through our experience, but at the same time are not too far ahead of it so that they're out of touch with what it means to be at our certain level.
And I think this applies for you because, again, listening, we're attracting high-quality people. You are often in your world the one that is helpful to the people around you. So giving advice would apply this way as well. When I talk to my 11-year-old son, Gunnar, my advice for him is much different than it's going to be when he's 25. I'm going to give him much different advice. At 11, I want to prevent all the hassle he's going to have through his teenage years. I want to just give him all of my information that I want to give him. I'm like, hey, do this, do that, don't have this thing happen. And I go, wait a minute, he's 11. He has to experience this. I can't help him skip steps. He has to make the mistakes. He's got to feel it for himself. He's got to go through the experiences himself. I can't give him adult advice for 11-year-old context. He's just not in that context. So even giving advice, I think it's important to have this framework as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Gunner's he just entered 3 red. He is massively ego identifying. He's like figuring out who he is independent of anybody else. And so it is it's tough to coach a kid through that level because they're basically whatever you are, they want to be the opposite. So if you're in a good mood, they're in a terrible mood. If you're in a terrible mood, they want to be in a good mood. They want to be out of sync with you because they want to individuate. Exactly. So it is a tough level to be in. And all of the advice that we would give as, because we're higher level than 3, red, all the advice we want to give them is appropriate for our level. So we have to be conscientious and aware that what he's really looking for is individuation. So the advice we give him has to go around gaining individuation, and it's got to be appropriate for his level. So after you have self-diagnosed where you're at in the Graves model in spiral dynamics, then now take your personal development project and ask where it's at in this model. Because I believe that thoughts, concepts, memes, belief structures, and projects, I believe they all fit on all of these models. We can sort of objectify them and see them as outside of ourselves and ask where do they fit on all of this? And what is the best advice you would give to something that's at a level 3 red, even if you're not, but it's a part of who you are, right? Because I'm at a higher level than 3 red, but there are parts of who I am that are stratified down there. And there are personal development projects that I'm working on that are down there. In fact, one of my lifelong personal development projects has been accepting the way that I look. Because when I was a child, when I was Graves 2, or what's known as purple in spiral dynamics, when I was at that level, I got a lot of messaging about how a woman is supposed to look. And I just ate it up and ate it up and ate it up. And I finally, I believe recently, allowed myself to graduate away from purple into red and individuate my own concepts of an identity around beauty and what a woman's supposed to look like. This is going to sound ridiculously unsophisticated, but I'm just going to share with you an aha moment I recently had. And this is you listening is probably going to go you just figured this out and you're 39 years old. And I'm like, yeah, I just figured this out. A couple days ago, finally figured out that I'm allowed to feel sexy and that there's no mood or emotion police that's going to drive up to my house and go, no, you're not allowed to feel sexy because you don't look a certain way. There's nobody policing that. My biggest fear was that I was going to feel sexy and then somebody's going to go, well, you don't have any right to feel sexy because you don't look a certain way. And it just dawned on me, wait, that's a feeling, and I'm actually allowed to feel any way that I want to feel. I get that right to feel that way, and there's no emotion police or emotion judge on high that's going to come down and tell me that I don't have a right to that feeling. It doesn't matter what I look like. I get a right to that feeling if I want to. Blew my mind. Blew my mind that I have a right to feel however I want to, including and not limited to the feeling of sexy. This is me individuating from a long-standing family tradition, right? And my family probably would be horrified if they knew that I picked this all up from them. They don't think in these ways at all, but these were the messages I got. So I'm going into an Graves 3 red individuation process with my relationship with sexy, which is crazy that I'm 39, almost 40 years old, and this is where I'm at in that process. But I'm honoring it, and I'm fueling the individuation. That's what I'm trying to feed it. I'm trying to feed it all sorts of content around how I am allowed to feel however I want to. I'm allowing my ego to inflate in this area. I'm allowing to inflate and go, yeah, I'm beautiful, I'm sexy, I'm whatever I want to be, because I know that that's where that process is at. Later on down the line, that will not be an appropriate thing for me to feel. But right now, it's the right thing to feel and nourish. So this is what we mean by recognizing timelines and accurately diagnosing where your project, not just who you are, but where your process and your project is at on these timelines and on these models in order to nourish it where it's at and meet it where it's at so it can get to the next phase.
I thought as you were saying that, and I know we need to wrap up because I could go down a whole line of talking about the timeline around that. But I was just thinking in terms of this also helps us, again, see other people with more compassion about where they're at. So, let's say you're a 21-year-old woman, and the men that are your age, 20 to 22, they're like they're inflating their egos and they're posturing around you. And you're like, man, are all these men just like, why are they like this? Like all these guys my age are posturing and putting themselves out there. Well, it might just be the context they're in and the appropriate time period to basically do what you're doing now later in life, Antonia. But for them, maybe it's inflating their ego, sense of self, a sense of individuation. It's appropriate for a time. Now, if they're doing that when they're 50 years old, that might be a problem or a challenge. But a little bit when you're young, maybe inflating your ego or identifying yourself as superior in that way, it helps get a sense of self, some sovereignty, things of that nature. But I think there's something to be said for this, that the things we look at and we say, well, that's a problem or a challenge. It might be a problem and challenge. And it also might just be a problem and challenge in that context at that time as well. So it gives us a way to give grace to other people and where they are in their process.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the correlation that came up for me is maybe a person who is really trying to implement boundaries in their life for the first time, and they're not great at it. So they end up creating some barriers, or they end up, like maybe being too spiky because they're just trying to create some boundaries, and this is a new thing for them. And I think that happens with a lot of us. And on the flip side, not only does it help us have some grace for other people and where they're at in the process, but it also helps us diagnose like where somebody's stuck. Like, okay, this is the thing that you should be graduating from now, and you just keep using the same strategies over and over. Not that it's necessarily for us to tell people that if they haven't asked for that piece of information and give them unsolicited advice, but it might be a way for us to gauge whether or not somebody is healthy for us. Like if somebody is stuck in a phase that they should have graduated from, beyond at this point, that might not be somebody that we want to really align ourselves with because they're obviously evidencing stuckness and a lack of desire or an inability to move forward. So that also helps us, do a better job of creating relationships. And it helps us self-diagnose. Where am I at? Am I stuck in something? Why am I stuck? Where am I at? Like, am I holding on to dependent tools too hard and I don't want to move to independent? Or, am I in the independent phase and I'm just new here and I just don't, it feels like I'm regressive, but actually I moved to a completely different space and now it's just a new space for me. So it also helps us diagnose where we're at, cut ourselves some slack, recognize where we're stuck, and kind of help us move through, the pipeline a little easier.
Yeah. What do you think? We want to hear your thoughts. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment or ask a question directly below this show. Let's get a conversation started about this idea of timelines and processes in your personal growth journey or in the things that you're going through in your life. Where are you? Have you been out of sync? Have you taken into account the timeline as one of the nodes in the system of your personal development? Has it been something that's been a struggle for you to realize where you are in the stream of things in your development? We want to hear your personal stories. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you'd be willing to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.